Now, in this section, you learned quite a bit about RxJS and observables. And of course, you can explore the official documentation to dive even deeper and to explore all these different operators RxJS offers to you. But to conclude this section and to give you at least some idea of what's happening behind the scenes when an observable is created and when a subscription is set up, we'll conclude this section by building a new observable totally from scratch, so without using a creation operator like interval. And therefore, I'll add a new observable here. Custom interval is the name I'll choose here for the property that will hold it. And the value of this property now is an observable that's created by instantiating the observable class. So observable here is a class that's imported from RxJS. And it is a class you can use to build an observable from scratch. Put in other words, built-in creation operators like interval use this class under the hood. Now we're going to use it ourselves to build such an observable from the ground up. Now the constructor function of this observable class in the end takes a function as an input. A function which will then itself receive an argument. So we should pass a function to this constructor function, and here I'll simply create an arrow function. Now this function, which we pass to the observable constructor, will then receive a subscriber as an argument. Because this function, which we pass to the observable constructor, will essentially be executed by RxJS whenever we subscribe to this observable. That's why we then get this subscriber, so an object that in the end connects us to this subscription that's being set up. That's why we get this as an input in this function here, automatically passed in by RxJS when that function here is executed, which, as mentioned, is the case whenever a subscription to this observable is set up. Now, inside of this function, we can and typically will therefore interact with that subscriber argument here, with that thing we're getting. And that thing which we're getting here, in the end, is that observer that allows us to invoke methods like next or complete or error. And that might sound familiar. We also were able to define a next method, not invoke it, but define it when setting up a subscription. When calling subscribe, we passed an object to subscribe where we did define a method called next, so a property which stored a function called next. And when creating an observable, we're simply interacting with that observer object, and we're controlling when that next function that we define when we set up the subscription will be invoked. So when we set up the subscription, we define what happens when this next event here is triggered, so to say. When creating the observable, we on the other hand control when exactly that next event will be emitted. So here we don't control what will happen when we emit this next event, but we control when we emit it. And when setting up the subscription, we on the other hand define what happens when that next event, if you want to call it like this, is emitted. So therefore here in our custom observable, we could, for example, create an interval with the setInterval function, which has nothing to do with RxJS, but which instead is provided by the browser. We could use it, as we could always use it in any project, to define some code that will run every second or every 2 seconds, whatever you want. Now here inside of that function that I passed to setInterval, I then want to trigger this next event, so to say. I want to make sure that my observable emits a new value. And that's what happens when you call next on this subscriber. Now you can also pass a value to next, a value that will be sent along with that event, a value that can be received when setting up that function that should execute when a new value is emitted when setting up that subscription. So this value, which you handle here when setting up the subscription, that value can be defined and emitted when emitting here inside of the observable definition. So for example, here we could emit an object, let's say, with a message property of new value and a value property of 1, whatever you want. Here I'll just emit an object with a message property. And I do this every 2 seconds because I created an interval here. I'll also add a console log statement here and say emitting new value ... Well, and now with that custom interval created here, we could of course go to ng-on-init, let's say, and use it here to call subscribe as we did it on all those built-in observables. And again, you pass your observer object to it and you define what happens when that next event is emitted. So when next is called inside of the observable. I accept that value which I'll get and I'll then just log that value. So a very simple subscription. And of course, we also should store the subscription and clean it up when the component is destroyed. But here, to keep things simple, I'll just set up the subscription. And with that done, you'll see that if you reload your running Angular application, this code here, these values here, are coming from our custom observable. And that is therefore how you can create an observable from scratch, and that is in the end what happens inside of these observables. Now it's worth noting that you're not limited to just emitting new values. You also sometimes have observables that maybe should be done at some point of time. Later in the course, once we start sending HTTP requests, we'll encounter observables that are done after a response has been received. So it is possible that you have observables that should not keep on running forever. Interval and also my custom interval here are running forever, but it doesn't have to be like that. For example, here in my custom interval observable, I could add a variable, count, or times executed, whatever, which is 0 initially. And then here, whenever I emit a new value, I increment times executed, like this. And I then check at the beginning if times executed is greater than 5, let's say, or 3 maybe, to reach that point a bit earlier. And if that's the case, I actually want to clear that interval and also complete that observable to clean up the subscription and to make it clear that no new values will be emitted. Now I can clear the interval by storing this interval ID in the end in some constant or variable, because setInterval does return such an identifier. And then here in the if statement, I can call clear interval and clear it like this, using some standard JavaScript code. So this has nothing to do with RxJS. And I can also use my subscriber to call complete. And with that, I'll emit an event that will automatically clean up the subscription and that will make it clear that there will be no future values. And then here I'll return. Now, you can also listen to that complete event when setting up a subscription. In that observer object here, you can not just define a function that should be executed if a new value is emitted, so when the next event occurs, but you can also set up a complete function that will be triggered when the observable completes. So here we could say completed and log that. If you do that and you reload, you'll see that we again start emitting values. That works like before, but then at some point we'll get completed. Essentially, we get this as soon as the times executed variable has a value greater than 3, so at least 4. That's why we get 4 logs here. And then it's completed and no new values are emitted. And that's therefore also something observables can do, both built-in observables or observables offered by Angular and observables you might be building on your own. And last but not least, it's also worth knowing that the observables can also throw an error. You can emit an error event, which can carry some error data. Now, I don't need that here, but if you had some logic wrapped in an observable that could fail, you might want to emit such an error value. Because of course, when setting up that observer, you can also define an error function that will be triggered whenever an error occurs. That is also possible. And that's therefore how you can create custom observables and how these observables interact with these observers that you pass to these subscribe functions. In the end, it's this observer object that's received as an input in this function that's passed to the observable constructor. And you can then control when exactly, so at which point of time, which event is triggered. So when exactly which observer function here will be executed. That's how observables work under the hood. And that's now it for this section here. Of course, there's way more you could learn about RxJS and observables and subjects. There are many more functions you could learn about and many more related concepts you could explore. And you absolutely can consider doing this with help of the official documentation, and you'll also see some additional examples throughout the later course sections. It's just also worth noting that, as I mentioned before, RxJS is used in parts of Angular and is popular in parts of the Angular community. And there are teams that heavily use it. But not everyone loves it, not everyone wants to work with it, and as an Angular developer, you don't necessarily need to work with RxJS. Especially as of late, there also have been some tendencies in the Angular team to make RxJS more optional in the future. Either way, you should know what an observable is though, what its main idea is, what a subject is, in the end an observable where you emit your own values. And you should know that you need to subscribe at least once to start it, and that you can convert from observable to signal and vice versa. And that there are some important differences, like that initial value which a signal always has, whereas an observable doesn't necessarily have that. And in general, that signals are in the end about managing values, whereas observables are about managing events or values that are emitted by some data source over time, instead of values that are managed by you. And of course, it's also worth keeping in mind that you have the massive amount of operators here, like that map operator I showed you, which can make working with values that are produced by an observable easier than it might be with working with signal-based values. But that, of course, always will depend on your project and use case. Now you know about both features and you'll see both features in action throughout the course.